There we are. Okay. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the Greensboro History Museum's October webinar series, Discover Piedmont Archaeology. My name is Catherine Johns. I am the tour coordinator and resource specialist for the Education Department at the Greensboro History Museum. During the month of October, during this webinar, we will be joined by members of UNCG's Archaeology program from the Anthropology Department, and later by a member of the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. Today's conversation is made possible in part by the Greensboro History Museums, Inc., the City of Greensboro, and the Libraries Department. Any views, findings, or recommendations expressed in today's program do not necessarily reflect those aforementioned entities. We are extremely pleased, as always, to have our guest audience join us. If you'll take the time to view the bottom of your screen, you'll see the Q&A icon. By selecting this option, you can type in questions for our panelists. Once you've typed in the question, hit enter, and you will have submitted it. We will be taking pieces of the presentation. We'll be taking little small pauses to be able to answer some of the questions that might have come up during those portions of Dr. Stine's presentation. This evening, we welcome our panelists for today's webinar, which will also be featured as an archive in our History Notes podcast section at a later date. At your convenience, please visit www.greensborohistory.org and select the tab Discover and Learn to hear the podcast when available. We also will be premiering this webinar tomorrow, October 13th, on the Greensboro History Museum YouTube channel at 5:30 p.m. So if you have watched this and want to rewatch it, or you want to send it to somebody else, just wait and you'll be able to find the recording there. Today's presenter is Dr. Linda France Stine. Dr. Stine is the director of the Archaeology program and associate professor in the Anthropology Department of UNC Greensboro. Dr. Stine, thank you so much for being here today, and I'm going to let you take it away.
Oh, well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm always excited to talk about our work at UNCG Archaeology within our wonderful community of Greensboro and in the surrounding region. I've been working here over 20 years and working with the community, so I have a lot I could talk about, and I'll try to pare it all down and just pick a few select sites as examples. So thank you again for inviting me.
We're delighted to have you.
So I thought I'd start out by explaining that historical archaeology is like any broader archaeology you might have heard about, classical archaeology, Oriental. But in our case, we get to use text. So it's a text-aided archaeology. We look at documents of all sorts. That could be diaries, that could be maps. But like any archaeologist, what I hope to do is figure out human behavior, past human behavior, by looking at material culture. That is the art, the artifacts, the sites, the landscapes people might have left behind. Quite often it's hidden underground. Therefore, I've also drawn in remote sensing techniques to help me smooth my way when I excavate. Most historical archaeologists will tell you that we deal with the archaeology of our world, the modern world, which some people start off around 1400 AD. And I think of it more as a time of colliding legacies, where you have members of many different types of cultures meeting together through colonization, exploration, exploitation, etc. And that's what I'm interested in. I'm very much like to research the origins of the South. So in geography, people will describe landscape, as Sowers did in a classic statement, as those works of man that are inscribed on the Earth's surface and give it characteristic expression. As you can see, here's a document, I think it's the Mosley map, 18th century map showing New Garden. And if you notice, it mentions Buffalo Road. and all the different creeks and rivers and other meeting houses. Well, as a anthropologist and archaeologist, I view landscape a little bit differently in a broader perspective. And I think about a landscape as something that's created between people interacting with one another, a social landscape that's also predicated on their legacy, their history, their cultural history. And it's their interface with the environment, and their culture is going to affect how they perceive what's useful within the environment. And I think of the built environment as, or the built landscape, is that interface between people and the physical world. And this is an air photo, by the way, of one of our excavations at Guilford Courthouse. So how do you find a site like Guilford Courthouse? Of course, that's already a park, so we knew it existed, a historic park. But a lot of times you just literally stumble over a series of artifacts or brick ruins. Quite often walking the fields of the Piedmont here in the backcountry, people will find indigenous made tools such as stone spear points or scrapers. You can also do a lot of research, look at old maps and try and figure out what old places might once have been located. And then you can do Google Maps. I have a good friend who years ago, as Google started, he also flew airplanes, so he loved that perspective. He used Google Maps from Chapel Hill to look and search for Iron Hill forts in France. And he would call up his friends in France and tell them, I found a site, and you know, they'd go out and look for it. So we often go out and survey, and that's what I do. As the archaeologist, historic archaeologist working here at UNCG, I'm the one that gets the phone calls, though, from the local community. So hi, everyone, be sure and call me if you find something of interest. Sometimes those calls are really unexpected. One day after St. Patty's Day, so during St. Patty's night, someone somehow jumped the curb out at the national park, knocked over poor old General Jethro Sumner, very well-known Revolutionary War general, his monument, and went through a couple of fences and everything. And luckily, they weren't hurt too badly, but the monument was all askew. And Chuck Cranfield, the superintendent, was quite worried that a looter may sneak on the property and try and dig up the poor man's body, looking for artifacts. That's one problem in archaeology, is we have to try and really protect our sites from people looting them, and in some cases desecrating them. So in this case, a student decided to come help me, fortunately, and we came out, and as you can see in the bottom of your screen, we found a little brass box, and luckily I managed not to break a very fragile bayonet that was resting right across this brass box. And it's a secondary internment, and that's why it was pretty small, like something like a big jewelry chest. And it's interesting to me because it shows that even with a secondary internment, there was a lot of pomp and circumstance, a lot of meaning in this commemorative ritual. The kind of thing I, as an archaeologist, am interested in studying. And you can see there also was a lot of pomp and circumstance when the park decided to rebury the gentleman. And that's what the middle picture is showing you. Burials. In this area, there are lots of lost burials because we had a good number of Revolutionary War skirmishes and a large battle, as most of you know, the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. So there are maps floating around like this one, the Draper map. I believe it dates to about 1852, where a gentleman had gone back to visit the site of that battle and sketched out the Hoskin family farmstead with their fields, a couple of the roads like New Garden, here it's called the Salisbury Road, And then the courthouse, the location of the courthouse, which is interesting because at the park, they really don't know the location exactly of the courthouse. That's one thing I hope to get to later today if I don't run on too long. But in this case, there are lots and lots of graves marked with X's. And so these lead us on these sort of chases, archaeological chases to find buried features. Some of the landscape research I'm involved in, as I said, deals with understanding changing settlement patterns in the area, in the backcountry. People first came and settled often in large tracts that were in pre-planned communities pretty much. And it was based on really close social ties of ethnicity and class. Later on, these sort of large nucleated settlements, even if they kind of dispersed within those settlements, started to merge a bit more as population came in, more and more population, and people needed land. And you saw the movement of some people out and other people in, which caused more mixing, which is very interesting. So I like understanding how the Moravians, Quakers, Scotch Irish, Presbyterian, Methodists, et cetera, Africans, people of indigenous descent, how did they collide? How did they all interact? And how did that change over time? One of the ways we do this is through remote sensing. We have a gradiometer, which is like a super duper metal detector that you had to be very cautious. If you were in marching band, you would be much better at it than someone who wasn't, because you would know how to pace yourself. You have to have a very steady timed pace. And then we also have remote sensing with GPR, ground penetrating radar, which is the buggy in the middle. You can see students working with my husband, Roy Stine, who was a geographer and remote sensor at UNCG. He just retired. And then we had metal detecting, which is the least expensive and most widespread kind of remote sensing that we use in archaeology. We were fortunate enough to hook up with the Old North State Detectorists, which is a local community group. They're very ethical, and they wanted to come out and work with us. The national park has to be very careful about, it's illegal to go out there and metal detect unless you have a federal permit or do an archaeological project. And so we teamed up, happy students and folks from the Old North State, and did a commendable job, I thought. So over the last 20 some years, we've been engaged in all sorts of remote sensing projects, combining remote sensing and archaeology. We even looked for a courthouse in Asheboro, not just in Greensboro. And it was not successful for finding the courthouse, but we did find lots of Victorian homes. We've worked at Buse Lindsay, Blandwood, Caldwell, and at all sorts of North Carolina historic sites, and lots more. Places I've held field schools in this region, for example, are the Hoskins House, which was Tannenbaum Historic Park, and now it's part of the National Park, with a standing log house and reconstructed kitchen. We also worked at Guilford Courthouse, as I said. I'll show you more later. Recently at the company mill, Smith Farm, which we were told was a Quaker farm, and it turns out no way, they were definitely Methodist, and they were pretty adamant about it, the descendants, and which was great to find out about. And that's near Hagenstone Park. And then we also did a great, interesting project at Blandwood Mansion in the backyard. Back to Hoskins and Tannenbaum Park, it's a good example to show you how we do our work. First thing you do in a project is find out what went on first before you got there. You collect oral history. You look at old photographs, maps, tax records, but also You find old archaeological reports. Wake Forest came out and worked at this house for the Battleground Company a good while back, and when they first purchased the property. And it turns out that they had seen that Draper map and saw bodies everywhere. So they had them come through, and I don't know, can you see my little arrow? They came through and they put trench after trench after trench with, backhoes, and monitored that, looking for those bodies, and they did not find them. What they did find was a lot of clay fill brought in. I found out for them later, it was brought in when folks constructed Battleground. They took any extra clay and dumped it on this site. Anyway, to level it off. So, but what they found in these trenches was a lot of material from the colonial era, all the way up through today, actually. We came here as well and did a good number of projects with UNCG students, did our own remote sensing metal detecting, and had to relocate all those units that Wake Forest did. You have to know what went on before you put in your own units. And so one of our students, she was so smart, she went in and took the existing Hoskins house footprint and took old maps, tax maps showing where a broader giant brick house had sat that incorporated that little log cabin inside it. And she figured out and could place an accurate map showing where that would have been situated around the cabin. It's important because Wake Forest used the sides of the house as datum points, and the house was gone. So she had to reimagine and register where that house once was. Anyway, so we went out there, we did shovel tests, and we do this at most of our sites. Went out and did shovel tests, these series of systematic little shovel, like windows under the earth. We screen everything in these very fine hardwire mesh screens. And then we put in the larger test units that are usually like 1 by 1 meter or 2 by 2 meters with a lot of inner control. And we found features such as here at the base of the Hoskins house chimney. You can see the footing, the big stone footing, and a little square post hole that was bisected by a poured concrete foundation for that brick addition to the little cabin. And so we were able to find features from many different time periods, all in the same unit. Here's an example of an early computer map that one of my students had made showing that unit 1 right here by the chimney, and the distribution of our shovel tests. These are just the ones that had stuff in them. And from that, I could figure out where people were engaged in certain activities on the farm. Now that's my introduction to archaeology, and I'm going to talk about Blandwood unless someone has a question about method.
This is one of the times where we will take questions right now. If you want to pop them into the Q&A. That was a fantastic overview of archaeology, particularly historic archaeology, of course, going through step by step, pretty much what is done in the field and why. If anyone has any questions, please pop them into the Q&A right now.
We also found lots of prehistoric artifacts at these excavations as well, because there was a very strong indigenous presence. Throughout the Piedmont.
Is it strong enough to say there was a settlement somewhere?
Here, it's more encampments.
Encampments. Okay.
Yeah. Now, it's very. I had a student look into trying to figure out why there weren't larger villages in this immediate area, and there was a lot of answers to do with soil and drainage and things like that. But we do have larger ones, of course, everyone should know, up at the Haw River State Park. Yes. A good number of settlements there and elsewhere. In the Asheboro area.
Oh, yeah. We've gotten 2 questions
Okay.
Actually, there is one that asks, how hard is it to get permits for metal detecting?
For federal property,
Mhm.
it's going to be difficult unless you are working on a scientific program, working with someone else on a real investigative research project.
And then we have a second one, which is this is interesting. I think it's because they definitely think that you know everything that's going on. They said that they understand there will be an archaeological dig near Swan Middle School, formerly Aycock Middle School. Do you know what the focus of that archaeological project will be?
I have no idea. I don't know who's digging there unless it's a cultural resource project. There are a lot of archaeologists who come into the area because someone is building or expanding some public place that is using federal money, technical assistance, advice, and it could be part of the regulatory milieu that we have going on, environmental studies. When you do an environmental impact study, I think you also have to do a cultural resource study.
We had a quick answer from the curator of education who says that he believes it might be to find the Cypress Street School.
Wow, that would be really interesting. I need to find out who's doing that. You should ask Mary Beth Fitz because she works for the state, and the state actually deals with permitting. That was the other part of my answer. So you have a state level permitting and a federal level permitting for anything that breaks the ground on private property and federal and public property. We have different ways of dealing with it. But
all right.
Shall we move on?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, let's move on. Okay, so in 2008, it was the bicentennial of Greensboro. Most of you should know Greensboro really got started in 1808 as this very small village. And it was a pre-planned town, again, on a grid plan. So remember that, a pre-planned town on a grid plan. And it was supposed to be the center of our county, but that would have put it in the middle of the swampy area of Fisher Park. So they moved it over to this area. And what's interesting is we were celebrating the bicentennial, and Blandwood had never done any archaeology, and they wanted to celebrate the bicentennial with a project. So the Greensboro History Committee asked us to apply, and so UNCG partnered with the Blandwood Mansion historic site. Ashley Petit was directing, and we co-wrote a grant, and we actually got it. It was really great. It was, again, community engaged. And in this case, our focus was to look for what we call the hidden lives of the enslaved and free Black laborers at Blandwood, because they really just didn't have much documentation that would bring that story to life for people. And so what we were looking for was just whatever kinds of settlement pattern or activities we might find in the backyard of Blandwood. Now, Blandwood was first settled in the 1790s by the Blands, and that's why it's called Blandwood. But it's really known for being the home of John Motley Moorhead, the governor, and his family, and his enslaved laborers. So that's what we'll talk about. And it started out as a small estate, a small farmstead that got larger and larger as different people like Mr. Humphreys came and up from Fayetteville area, and he bought this property, expanded the house, he expanded the property, and then his son-in-law, John Motley Moorhead, he showed up with his wife eventually and bought the place, and then vastly expanded the land and the house, as you could see. And the backyard would have been much bigger. Yeah, but you deal with what you have. And so we went and we decided to look all back in here for evidence of the lifeways of the whole family and you know, both black and white that lived there, all the residents of Blandwood. And first thing we did is come in and hire, teamed up with New South, which is a company, a local archaeology company that we're really proud of. And Sean Patch was directing this. And Sean is a graduate from UNCG, so we're proud of that as well. And he came out and our students helped now and then. Hopefully didn't hinder. I think they did help. They learned a lot, and he surveyed this area for us. We didn't have the machines at the time. And we found things like long straight lines. As you can see, the different colors here on this image. These are things hidden beneath the ground that the radar bounces back at a different rate based on whether it's metal, you know, heavy, dense something or a real permeable or impermeable. And so that turned out to be utility pipes. Not really exciting, but good to know about. And we found lots of other things. I direct your attention, this is the carriage house, or used to be the carriage house. A lot of you have been married in here, you know, or gone to events here. But this carriage house used to be way over here by the school, the existing school, and it got moved. This is a landscape that moved a lot. It changed. So let's keep going. So we really wanted to work there to find evidence for settlement pattern. That means what went on? How did the landscape, how was it created? How was it used? How did it change? And I wanted to see that over time. Archaeologists always deal with time and space. And most importantly, we were looking for any kind of material evidence of an African-American presence and to educate all those students next door and anyone who wanted to come visit. We had some very interesting documentary evidence that I'll get back to, which is one of the Moorhead daughters kept what I might call a day book that we looked at it and then it was lost for a while and then it was refound. And it's very interesting, very hard to decipher at first. I'll get back to that. I'll get back to clues about lives hidden in that book. We had oral history, we had the maps, and we remote sensing and archaeology. Some of the maps, and I ask anyone, if you know of any maps of Greensboro, the city, that predate 1879, I would love to see them. We've been looking and looking and looking. The ward, what I call the ward map from 1879 is actually available at UNCG now. They digitized it for me. They're very nice to do that. And you can see here's Blandwood, but it doesn't have its dependencies attached in this map. But you can see in a bird's eye map from 1891, you know, here's Blandwood in all its glory, where you have the carriage house way over here. You have a well and a windmill sitting right where the carriage house is now, or in that vicinity. And you have lots of outbuildings. And what we're trying to discern, and you know, this is 1890s, but it's the only clues we have to the past, the 1870s and the 1890s, other than archaeology. And so I went and looked back, and someone did work here in the 1980s. I've chatted with this gentleman in person. We've really talked about Blandwood a lot, and they found like remnants of staircases. And at the time of the purchase, the property in the 80s or 70s, 80s, the side dependencies weren't standing anymore, and it was a very, very different building in terms of use. So he was able to find the remnants, enough of the footings so that they could rebuild eventually. And that's important. That's one thing archaeologists do. We were able to look at like the word map produced by Beers and Company and overlay it on this image of Blandwood to try to figure out we kept finding all these little walls everywhere. And we're just trying to figure, here's a real important one, trying to figure out if it went with any of the buildings in the 1870s. Where did they match? Where did they not match? And then we did this with the Sanborn maps in later time periods. Okay, take a breath. Now, one of our students here, Ari, he is having to clean up a unit that is just full of interesting pieces. Here is a bottle that's popping up in the dirt. It had ceramics, bone, bottles, you name it. But it was found under a good 30 to 40, even 50 centimeters of a clay rubble cap. So a bunch of fill. Again, someone came into the site, not uncommon with urban sites, filled it all, smoothed it all out, and capped and buried and protected the archaeology. So that was good. It protected the archaeology. My students didn't like it. They had to dig, as I did, through this clay, which is not fun, but they got to this a very beautiful loose topsoil, which is topsoil from at least 1980, if not a little earlier, that's been protected. And from there on, we had all sorts of materials dating to the colonial and antebellum era. So that's what he's doing. That's the stratigraphy. So it had very definite stratigraphy at Blandwood. And we were happy to see we found a lot of the same things as they'd found in the 80s, which is always good when you match the previous work. And you could see near the kitchen, they found all sorts of almost whole plates with beautiful, landscape scenes. And you would expect that from the Moorheads. And also the Moorheads, we found matching pieces, not exact matching pieces, but it was a set. So now we know the Blandwoods purchased their ceramics in sets. So the way we did the work, as I explained, was pretty systematic and straightforward. And it's something that we just kept doing at all our different sites over and over again to make the data comparable from each site. When we began the excavations, you could see we had all sorts of visitors, lots of students, and it was definitely an interesting downtown urban kind of site to work at. Here we are in the backyard, and we put in almost 40 shovel tests. And the bare spaces are where giant big trees used to be. We've lost one of them, as some of you may know, at Blandwood. The big oak is gone. But we couldn't work in some places because of vegetation. And then these squares, these are our test units, the bigger units. And I want to draw your attention again to this one right here. This is where we found a wall that didn't show up on any of the older maps. One thing that we can do is what we call density maps. And I think it's pretty easy for anyone to read where you get the darkest color and the tightest topographic looking lines. That's where the most stuff was found. And so this tells me where people were throwing the most trash or doing the most activities. And so people are keeping it pretty clean around the back of the house, aren't they? But right back in here, there's a lot of bone and other things happening, and trash burning and trash back in here, and a lot of extra brick here. I found out later that's because they tore a building down from there. Here's some prehistoric artifacts, just some of the stone that we found. This is, middle archaic. It's a LaCroix piece of a LaCroix point. You can see the little bifurcated feet that I call the hafting element. And it's a used up one. It's an old one that maybe someone tossed because it's broken and wasn't really working anymore. And one of my students found it in a shovel test, which is unusual. They were very happy. And it was one of over 6,500 artifacts we found at Blandwood, just in that bit of backyard. And as I said, the stratigraphy was pretty complex. It took a while to understand, but once we did, we could excavate in these levels that you can see here. And I always think it's so much fun to show people, hey, people used to walk here down under. I call it buried living surfaces. And it's pretty obvious when you could see topsoil what we're talking about. And one of my master's students and my husband's master's students, he did one of these real neat 3D models showing what the different levels, the different stratum might have looked like, each stratum of the strata. All right, so what did I find out with all of this stuff? Well, I found out that they really changed from a farmstead to a urban picturesque estate. And it was a slow transition. And that even during Governor Moorhead's time as governor, he had animals in the back, and he had livestock, and he had trash piles, and which is really interesting. We don't think about it. We don't think about the active landscape that would have occurred in the backyards of our homes in the late 1700s and early 1900s, if I can get it out. It's by the 1880s that you finally had sewage, and you had utilities and garbage pickup and those sorts of things. Before that, you had to do it all yourself or walk into town. And here's just an example of, this is a gutter clamp, which is an artifact that are difficult to find. I'm glad I took a picture, because by the time it made it back to the lab, it had been dislocated from one another, because it's just little, rusty metal.
Oh no.
Yeah, even if you're so
Oh, no.
careful, things can break in archaeology. So we document everything. And also I wanted to show that we have lots of 19th century intrusive features. This is, all old lines, gas lines. Here's a wall from the building, the Keeley Rest Home for genteel alcoholics. Blandwood served that purpose for a while. We found other walls that had been presumed to be present. We actually found them, and you had a utility cutting through them. We found other, here's a shovel test. You had to stop because we hit all this brick. When you clean it all off, look what you get, this really big wide wall in this little unit with a tiny little builder's trench and a utility going through it. So urban archaeology is pretty complex. And we found all sorts of stuff from the colonial through the Keeley Institute time periods. We had bricks, we had ceramics, we had local made, we had European, and we found a blue bead. And I and some colleagues, they're like Bohemian or Venetian glass beads that were used in the indigenous trade and in Africa, in the trade in Africa. And so you can find them from certain kinds of sites at certain time periods. And some friends and I long ago had looked at a lot of different low country plantation sites and then across the country, and found out a statistical correlation between the presence of blue beads and places where enslaved people worked. And there's been a lot of work done since. It's ongoing research. It's ongoing research. But so we were pretty excited when we found that, because it may represent African-American presence in a different way than a document. It's a piece of material that may have been worn by personal choice, but we're not positive yet. But it's pretty exciting, except it was found in a giant pit. And you can see the top of the pit here. We only took a quarter of it out, and it was full of deep, oops, excuse me. I have a very quick trigger figure. It had this really thick clay, and then the pit was coming down on the side wall. See it right here on the side wall. And the top of this, in this fill, from the 1980 reconstruction of the house, they had hit a feature that had that blue bead in it and churned it all up. So the context is all right, but not great. But it's an exciting find. We're glad to have found it. We don't know what that big pit's for. We think maybe to put a big tree or a sign. But underneath that pit was a living surface and a pad, a pier for some sort of little outbuilding. And then it even had a really nice brass hasp, like for a lock or something. So that was pretty interesting. And in that same area, we found that kind of a gold rimmed, very faint remnants of a gold rimmed porcelain. It's the fancy stuff that the Moorhead family could use and bring out for special occasions. But I'm more excited by the brick, because this is a brick wall that no one had ever expected at all. It didn't show up in the GPR, maybe because of all the nasty clay fill. That our students found it in a shovel test, as you can see. And when we extended it back, all the fill right above it, so the dismantling of the building fill, it dates up to about the 1840s. So that's when Moorhead really greatly expanded his house. So we think that perhaps predates the expansion and the fancying up, making his house into a beautiful Italianate national landmark. So this is either where some enslaved people lived, we hope, we think, because it'd be wonderful to find the houses we know that were out here, or it's where folks worked, because it might be the smokehouse. We found a lot of domestic debris and bone. Here's some examples of the domestic debris. We have your typical bottles, hand blown into molds. You have a little finial that went to like a teapot or a sugar bowl or something. Really nice hand painting on it, about 1820, 1830s. We also found lots and lots of window glass throughout the site, and by plotting it in space, you could actually plot when the house kept getting remodeled, which is really an interesting new process one of our master students came up with, thought about and came up with. So here's that remodeling I'm talking about. So we think that structure predates this remodeling. And again, just looking at the distribution in the units, there's something happening in that same unit by the wall, and also up here closer to the house in this cave. But one of the things we found, like I said, is a lot of evidence of what they were eating, and they ate a lot of pigs. They had a horse. They had oysters brought in from the coast, which is really interesting, pretty cool to think about. And we know from a probate inventory that Governor Moorhead actually left to his wife horse, cattle, hogs, lots of pigs. So they were there on the property. So we found it archaeologically, and here it is documented. Notice she's a Lindsay, because the Lindsays and the Moorheads, the Caldwells, and many other well-known names are all what we archaeologists might call the leaders or the elite, social elite of this area. And these are the kinds of things they were eating. And we also look type by type. We look, where was all the bone found? Well, most of it was found by that little wall, some of it by the house. We found lots of really neat local ceramics. So the talk last week, when you heard Jeff Hughes talking all about the local ceramics from Old Salem, we thought most of the stuff here would be from maybe trade with Old Salem, but now we're thinking, no, it's probably from local Quaker and Germanic potters to the east and southeast of us, et cetera, and maybe some trade with folks in Virginia. Pretty neat. But here's some of those local wares that I'm hoping Jeff will come look at in my lab, but he promises he will. because they're very similar to some of the materials made at Old Salem. They're also made by some potters east of us in Alamance County. If you worked at Caldwell, Catherine, like I know you did, at the Caldwell site, you found very similar ceramics, pearlware ceramics with these kinds of floral designs. We found these at Martinville as well, and Guilford Courthouse, which is at Hoskins House. And that just tells us that there was a brisk trade in similar types and styles of ceramics. And these aren't the most expensive, but they're not the cheapest either. They're kind of middling in between, which is what you might expect. And again, you know, mostly by the house. There must have been a trash midden going this way. And then here around this structure 7. We found all sorts of buttons and rivets and, you know, all sorts of material and lots of rivets and game pieces. And I finally found out from Benjamin Briggs, head of Preservation Greensboro, that Moorhead actually had a tin shop. Yeah, and now he thinks from newspaper articles it was in front of that, north of the house, which is interesting, towards the town. And then we had all these bricks. These are handmade bricks. You know, what does that mean, right? Well, we could see the changes in building style over time, but also it made me think about the intensive labor that went on at Blandwood to construct this house and keep reconstructing and adding to it. Which gets me to the laborers. When I first came to Greensboro, we weren't as investigating as hard, you know, looking as hard for the lives, to understand the lives of the enslaved. People were more concerned at the time with trying to understand Warnersville and other really exciting 20th century places that are important heritage places for our Black and white community, our whole community. But it's interesting because at Moorhead at Blandwood, he had in 1850, they listed, I think, about 37 individuals that were enslaved on this rather larger at the time property. And we're just trying to figure out, where did these folks live? And then if you look in 1860, as I'll show you, they do mention they had 2 cabins or 2 houses of structures of some sort for the enslaved. And still, though, you know, that's a lot of people. So we're just trying to figure this out. Where did people live? How did they live? By 1860, one of the women was, she was set free, but she was 105 for the estimate. And I want to also say thanks to Benjamin and Preservation Greensboro and Blandwood folks sharing with me, in the 1870 census, there were freedmen listed as working at and living with the Moorheads. Later, they have their own house, their own place. And it's Mrs. Hannah Jones and Sam Jones. I'm not sure if they were married or not. I kind of assumed it, but that's an assumption. And she had children that were listed as living there. And then another gentleman by the name of, I believe it's Tynan Moorhead, and he was 24 years old. So that's pretty interesting. And in a will later on from Governor Moorhead's wife left some bedsteads to some of these folks. So that's a very interesting relationship that Benjamin's investigating. So again, I want to emphasize, Jeff Thigpen with his transcribing of all the property deeds, and with UNCG with the grant that's people, not property, we're learning so much more about who were the enslaved people and later freedmen living in our community. And one thing is that expense or day book of Letitia Moorhead, Moorhead's daughter. Just looking through it, I started realizing she was naming some of the people that her property, the people that she had listed as her enslaved people, some of them, because she's hiring them out. It took a while to figure out, but there was extensive hiring system going on in this area. I haven't published on this yet, but I'm working on it. But it's pretty complex. But if you think about it, it's one way that you don't have to feed people, right? At off hours, or when you can't keep someone busy in terms of laboring, then you might hire their work out. But what really struck me was that she was hiring people out with their children. So on one hand, it's keeping some children with their parents, especially their mothers, but also I don't know if that meant they're working as well. I would assume so, but I don't know enough. I've read about a system like this in Virginia, and it'll be interesting to compare the two. But what I really love is we have names now. We have some names for people who were present in the Greensboro landscape. And that's another wonderful part of Jeff Thigpen's work at the Office of Deeds, is to leave this information public for all of us to look at and learn from. So here's just an example of some of that information. Now, okay, where do these people live? Sometimes they may live in the house, and at a pallet, maybe, in a nursery. I think that maybe Hannah and her family would have lived in the kitchen area or laundry in one of the dependencies, because she was the woman in charge of that area of the household cooking with Eliza, with her, the woman that owned her. But she was someone who preferred to just be out in the garden and not have to entertain and things like that. So I could see them maybe having some sort of very complicated relationship that we just don't know. We just don't know. But what kind of housing? We know that one of the Lindsays, here's the Lindsay name again, that he had 9 enslaved people at his urban estate on the outskirts of Greensboro, which now is well within our city limits, and that he had 2 slave dwellings, just like Moorhead. We know at a place called the Oaks, there were 53 people, and this is right on the outskirts of little downtown Greensboro at the time, and he had 7 dwellings. So the one picture we have for Lindsay is of a duplex, and it's brick. It probably had 2 families, at least. I've studied this so much elsewhere. You can get different arrangements. You might have single men in one and single women in the other, but quite often you have 2 families, extended families, living in each. But we're not sure. So here's one idea of what an abandoned cabin might have looked like. And then we found this photograph at your museum in the archives. And it's interesting because I think it said, it was scrawled on the back that it was J.T. Moorhead's cabins for the enslaved. But the pictures later, because you have utilities, and there's a church steeple in the back, and there's 2 photographs, and you can see again brick duplex structures, very similar. So maybe that's a pattern. We only have 2 examples, but maybe it's going to be a pattern, and we need to do a lot more research. But you can see people needed a lot of wood for cooking and cleaning and doing laundry. And he had, in 1850, they listed him as having 8 enslaved individuals, but by 1860, 107 in 18 different so-called cabins. I call dwellings. So, that's a question there, isn't it? To understand. And Benjamin came by and we were talking about a lot of this, and what I told him I might bring this up. He said it's okay. But I figured out whose place it might be on. He figured out where the cabins might be, and it might be under, right downtown near where the big governmental plaza is. But, we need to keep checking. And that's based on old maps and looking at the church steeple and, trying to figure out where this is. So that's my Blandwood story.
So we have quite a few questions. So The first one is, and this is your chance, folks, to ask any questions about the Moorheads, the people that they were enslaving upon their property, that evidence has come forward about, that Dr. Stine was talking about. The first question is, wasn't Hannah too old to have a toddler?
Well, my grandmother was 49 or maybe 47 when she had her last child. So my answer is
No.
I don't know, but it can happen.
Yeah, we actually have someone in my family as well who gave birth very in mid 40s. So that's
Called surprise children, usually.
yes, surprise children.
Surprise.
We have a question which was for a few slides, quite a few slides previously, which was what types of items were found under the topsoil shown in the picture that had a bottle emerging from the dirt.
Right. Well, you saw a picture later because that was the debris that I think dates pre 1842, 1846 construction of the Italianate expansion of the Moorhead Place. So yeah, we had that finial, that cool little lid piece. It looked like we had all sorts of bottle pieces and other ceramics and nails and a lot of bone, a lot of food bone, no human bone. No. Yay, no human bone.
Yeah. Do you want to tell the audience real quick what happens when human remains are found?
Sure. Yeah, I've been through that. When human remains are found, you immediately, by an archaeologist, yeah, I call the state archaeologist and we talk about whether it's in context. If it's in a non-disturbed context, I could tell them if it's found underneath a older living surface, and then they could pretty much guarantee whether it's a body the archaeologist deals with, the state archaeologist, and their rules, or if I have to call the coroner. And usually I call the coroner anyway, or the state archaeologist does, because you want that coroner to come look and say, yes, it's not a murder victim and it's not a modern person. Yeah, they're very specific rules.
Yes.
You stop everything.
Yes, everything stops. That's the very annoying part, is everything must stop as soon as you find human remains.
And you have a lot of respect. I should say that archaeologists have a lot of respect. We try very hard not to objectify the dead. You know, we recognize that they're the remains of human beings. We've come a long way.
Yes, no kidding. We've come a really long way in just a little over a century, right?
Yeah.
But some disciplines have to emerge and get with the times quickly. For anybody else, this is a chance again to ask any questions because we are at 7:00. So if anybody has questions relating to any parts of the presentation, or if you have heard that, for instance, Dr. Stine is the first person who did a lot of the major digs at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse area. I know that you and I were talking about the looking through what used to be the New Garden area of Greensboro. For those who do not know, that is the early Quaker settlement in Guilford County.
Yeah, we found a lot there. If we're going to stop now, and I could save the Guilford work for later, I could show people one thing.
Yeah, if you want to show people one thing, that'd be really cool.
I'm just going to
love to see you.
I'll talk about Guilford Courthouse another time, but something you all don't know.
It's a big subject.
Yeah, it's a huge one. Where did I put it? Well, let's just do it this way. Here is the ground penetrating radar. This is what I wanted to show.
Oh, it's a mess. Sorry, not a mess, but just wow.
You know, because one of the big final takeaways from all the projects we've been doing is some very excellent results about method. about archaeological method. And what we discovered is it's a wonderful marriage, not just being married to remote sensor me. No, it's a wonderful marriage between remote sensing and archaeology, because it saves time, it saves money, it lets us have a window peek under the earth and see these hidden features. But you don't know what it is. It's an anomaly until you dig it up. You really don't know till you put your eyes on it. So it's a partnership. And I wanted to show this particular image because people from the national park who are very good remote sensors had come in a lot earlier and had put these transects, what we call transects, they're, cuts sort of.
Yes.
They just walked every so many meters, in a straight line and collected data. And they really couldn't piece together a lot of the structures that we were able to find, because we worked and did contiguous work, big blocks, one big block at a time,
Yes.
and collected all the data and at different levels.
Mm-hmm.
And from that, here's a teaser for some other talk some other time. We found a hidden road, which may or may not be the retreat road.
Mm-hmm.
And then we found, like wells, maybe a huge, big structure that may be a cellar of a structure, and then a really nice stone footing, which could be related to that. And then midden full of garbage from the and Martinville era. So it was a very successful way to explore possibilities of where the courthouse might be. And I'll just say that we're pretty sure where one of the courthouses was, which would be great. We're just still manipulating some data. Are there any questions
Guilford
about
Courthouse? So, yeah, you have Guilford Courthouse questions if you're ready for them. I mean, that's a whole other beast. I only say this because I was a national park ranger, which is where I first met Dr. Stine, at the Guilford Courthouse National Military Park. And it is, the archaeology is extensive and has gone through many different different eyes, different forms, and I'd even say different scopes of where the park is, considering where they've been purchasing and where they've been kind of reclaiming some areas. I'm not sure if they want people talking about that necessarily or not, but they are, the national park does kind of actually reclaim some areas, including, of course, the old Tannenbaum, and that all is places worth possibly putting more archaeology in one day, maybe.
Oh yeah. The national park is like any wonderful public space. Their number one charge is to preserve, enhance, preserve, interpret, educate. But as part of that job, they need to assess their cultural resources. Yes. And that's where archaeology testing comes in. Although I would love to excavate a couple of a real cellar we know about and a potential cellar that you're looking at.
Yes.
It's safely kept, nice and safe at the park, underground. And so it's like banking something for the future.
Yes. It's very nice. Very nice. Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Stine. Let me read us out, and also, of course, give the big plug for Archaeology Day. So thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, Discover Piedmont Archaeology, Colliding Worlds, Lost Landscapes of Guilford Archaeology. Special big thank you to Dr. Stine from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro's Anthropology Department and Archaeology Program. I want to make sure to note for the community members, folks, that wonderful archaeology program from UNCG and UNCG's Archaeology Club will be helping the Greensboro History Museum host Archaeology Day on October 16th. That is this Saturday. That's with right. And it will be in a few different spaces. We will also have some cemetery tour guiding going on, and several really great activities for, I would say, pretty much all ages to look and enjoy. And of course, as always, if it's a Greensboro History Museum program, it is usually free, and it is this time as well. So again, if you know somebody and you want to have them come by, I believe the program's starting at 1. That's what I have on my records. It's starting at 1. And we would love to have you. Also, again, thank you for our entire audience. Your support is what makes this possible. We love being able to have you all with us. And tune in on Thursday. Yes, I said Thursday, October 21st at 6 p.m. for our next webinar, which is Discover Piedmont Archaeology, Archaeology of the Catawba Indian Nation. A quick note again, that is a Thursday, so it's going to be a bit different than normal. But as always, attendance is free, so don't forget to register. Go to www.greensborohistory.org or the Greensboro History Museum's Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter platforms to learn more. Thank you again to everybody, and have a lovely good night. So thank you very much, Dr. Stine, of course. big thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, there we go. And the recording is stopped now too. And we have a note from wonderful curator Rodney. Hi, Rodney, are you still on? Saying to thank you to all that attended.
Thank you, Dr. Stine. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Yes.
Great job, Kathy.
Thank you. Great job, Dr. Stein.
Rodney, I want to talk to you about this.
About the webinar?
Yeah, I just want to talk to you about Blandwood.
Oh, okay. Now or later?
Okay, it can be another time. I'll be hanging out Saturday. You coming down?
I'll be there.
Yeah, we can talk then.
Okay.
Okay.
Look forward to it.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all.
I'll
Thank
see
you. And hold on 1 second. Let me get the questions off.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
I'd like to see those questions.
Two were written in, and then I will write up the other 2 that people sent to me. You did such a good job covering the basics, Dr. Stein, that I did not have to stop you to ask that question, and I greatly appreciate that.
I hope I didn't spend too much time on that. I just did that instead of, I knew it would be too much by the time I got to Guilford, it would just be huge.
Oh yeah, no, it would have been gigantic. No, the Blandwood and talking about the Moorheads.
I think it's important.
It is. It's extremely important, and it's something that we really need to have more talks about.
Very sensitive, though. It's hard to talk about.
It's so sensitive for so many people. So many. Okay.
I assume people know that if there's a bunch of trash and garbage out there, that it's what everyone ate and what everyone was eating up. But then I thought maybe I should have explained that, that trash is every member of the household.
That's one that we, I know that I've tried to discuss that once, that we need to there's a few things that I would like to change in a few different places. And we have this great menu from the Clegg Hotel, which is a bit of a later time, but it is worth discussing. This is the food when it ends up in a midden, which is trash, but that it's something everybody was eating. So it's a really interesting topic to talk about. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you, Dr. Stine.
No.
Thank you, Rodney. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.